Welcome to Energy Frontier, the Wyoming Landscape Podcast. Hosted by Dr. Holly Krutka, Executive Director of the School of Energy Resources at the University of Wyoming. The show highlights SER's role supporting our mission to promote energy-driven economic development for the state of Wyoming.
Welcome back, listeners. I'm Holly Krutka, Executive Director of the University of Wyoming School of Energy Resources. Today, I am fortunate enough to talk to Director Creager, Rob Creager. He is the Executive Director of the Wyoming Energy Authority, a great collaborator for the School of Energy Resources. So thank you so much for being with us, Rob.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Let's start by telling our listeners a little bit about your professional background.
Yeah, well, thank you. So maybe before professional, I was born and raised in Casper, Wyoming. Went to the University of Wyoming, proud graduate of there in finance and economics. So not necessarily in the energy field right out of school, but as you know, Wyoming's economy basically is energy. So that's what we do. Spent a little bit of time in D.C., just long enough to know I wanted to get out of there and get back to Wyoming. So I helped on Governor Gordon's first campaign back in 2018. After that, really kind of got the itch to learn more about the political process, how policy was formed, and went to work for my high school football coach. He was Speaker of the House in the state legislature, Steve Harshman at the time. I spent some time with him and got to know just the ins and outs of how the state legislature works. The governor obviously was successful in his campaign, asked me to jump over the hill and work for him as a policy advisor. So I did that for a little over 5 years, and then this role came open, and I remember looking at the job description and thinking about, the future of the state of Wyoming. And in my opinion, if the future is going to go in a direction we want and to move the needle, it's got to go through energy. So I got really excited about that, put my name forward, went through that whole process, and was fortunate enough to be selected.
Great. I agree with you about the energy, of course. So I want to ask a little more about the process of getting this job. But first, for anyone unfamiliar, can you talk about the Wyoming Energy Authority, its background, how it was formed, and its mission?
Yeah, absolutely. So the Energy Authority is a melding of a few different authorities. So over the years, we had the Pipeline Authority for the state of Wyoming, as well as the Infrastructure Authority and the State Energy Office, which was housed in the Business Council at the time. In 2019, there had been this work for a few years to form more of a cohesive and sort of one-stop shop for energy for the state. And so that was the creation of the WEA. It officially started in July of 2020. So we're just a little over 4 years old. But yeah, it's really they combined the scopes of those three entities I talked about and then added some new things like nuclear, like rare earths, some of the other opportunities in the state. But I like to talk about, you said our mission is, pretty simple in a sentence. That's to advocate, facilitate, and advance Wyoming energy. But I also like to think of us as kind of a hub. And as you know very well, we're a very small team if you look at state energy offices across the state or across the country. But I often tell folks that it's not just us in this office. That, we have you all at School of Energy Resources we partner with, OGCC, EORI, all the different energy folks that we have in the state of Wyoming that really is a much bigger team than the 8 folks we have. So that's our mission. We really harp on reliability and affordability of energy, but it's endless opportunities.
Okay, let's talk about a few specifics of different things that the Wyoming Energy Authority covers. So let's start with something not everyone might have heard about, the Wyoming State Energy Program. So what is that exactly?
Yeah, so the State Energy Program, or the SEP as a lot of folks call it, was stood up back in 1970 during the energy crisis. Wow. So it's been around for a while, and that was one of the pieces that the Business Council managed for many years. And when the WEA was stood up, it got moved into our office. So Patrick Millen is our State Energy Program Manager, and he oversees what are grants to small businesses, to county buildings, to schools, to really help with upgrades to make them more energy efficient. Our angle on that is to help with affordability of energy. So whether that's lighting or whether that's HVAC systems or whatever might be outdated that fit in those programs, we get a annual appropriation from the federal government for that. It's gone up a little bit through the IIJA. There was a little uptick in that funding that we're using. But yeah, we put those out every year, and all across the state. There's a cool map on our website for the SEP that shows just the different school districts and different areas we've given those grants out to help, again, bring down those costs of energy.
And if someone, a business or a community organization or a school wanted to learn more, is the best way to learn more just to go to the WEA website?
Yep, definitely do that. And also sign up for our newsletter, because there is a application period. And we really push out on our social channels or through our email list that, hey, here it's open, it'll close at this date, and be ready. So yeah, those would be the best places.
Great. So let's move into more the main focus of what you've been doing as executive director of the Wyoming Energy Authority. You've worked a lot on, I call it maybe being a front door to interested energy parties and acting on behalf of the state of Wyoming, trying to help direct folks when they come to the state to all the different organizations you listed, the alphabet soup of Wyoming's energy sector. So let's talk about, what does WEA do to encourage emerging energy technologies and welcome technology developers to the state of Wyoming? Let's just go through different sectors of the energy economy, starting with oil and gas.
Yeah, that's a great question. So, one piece that I left out earlier about the Energy Authority is by statute, we're in charge of the state's energy strategy, which is no small feat. And yeah. I think the way we approach this is, it's not an either or, it's an and solution. So what can we do with oil and gas or coal or renewables or whatever, and not or. And so oil and gas, right now, we're really focused on working with Lon's team, as you all know, on EORI. Is there projects that we can help with on financing some of those to help bring down, for those of you that follow the federal policy making, Senator Barrasso just put out a bill that we helped work with him on to level the 45Q playing field to try to get more enhanced oil recovery in the state of Wyoming. So that's one of the things we've done with oil and gas. When I first started this job, I looked at the associations we were members of, and PAW was not on that list. So I called up Pete and said, hey, this is certainly a room we need to be in, and how can we help? So we started doing that and just really getting industry to know us and know who we are, given how new we are. Sometimes there's a question mark as to what we do and who we are. So oil and gas, I think, obviously pays a huge load of our taxes here in the state of Wyoming. So that is one of the areas of interest for us that we keep top of list.
You made so many good points. So when you said Lon, Director Lon Whitman, he's the director of the Enhanced Oil Recovery Institute, which is just the fact that institute exists is really cool for Wyoming. It's so important to squeeze as much oil as we can out of our existing reservoirs that are already leased, because leasing of oil and gas has gotten so difficult. And I think it's 67% approximately of Wyoming minerals are federal minerals. And it's just the regulatory and permitting hurdles have just gotten higher and higher. So if something's already permitted for oil production, you can use CO2 enhanced oil recovery to squeeze more oil out. And it's such a great opportunity for the state. And the cool thing about Wyoming is we already have expertise in it. We have the Enhanced Oil Recovery Institute that helps small producers. So I think that's a really good point. Okay, so same question. What about coal?
Yeah, so again, I keep forgetting to bring these up earlier, but I think another cool piece about the Energy Authority that I didn't touch on is kind of our governance structure.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
So while I serve in the governor's cabinet, I answer to a board of directors from industry. And our chair, Wendy Hutchinson, for anybody who's in the coal patch, I'm sure knows that name. We have a few other coal members on the board, Wanda and Ken Miller. But when you say, how are we trying to help with coal? Really, it's to build off of the research you guys have done. We obviously manage a lot of state money. You guys have done a ton of work over the years. So our number one thing is carbon capture. And I know sometimes some folks have questions about that, is it realistic? Is it too expensive? Why are we doing this? Those sort of things. And to us, I often point to a pretty startling fact of, if you look at in 2001, roughly 30 states in this country, their main source of energy was coal. You look at that now, and it's less than 10 states and less than 15% of all electricity generation. That is not what anybody in Wyoming wanted. That was what other states decided to do. Some of them decided to do that because, they have different standards for emissions or whatever that may be. And so I always tell folks our number one thing we want for coal is carbon capture, because if that is a knock on the industry and we can take that out of their, kind of weapon chest against us, then what's not to like? It's affordable, it's reliable, there's an abundance of it, we know how to mine it here in the state of Wyoming. So yeah, our number one thing for coal is, frankly, building off of the research that you guys have done and seeing which ones we can help finance and get across the finish line.
That's a great point. I should have brought up the governance structure earlier. We have that in common. So we both have boards of directors that are made up mostly of industry folks. Mine's called the Energy Resources Council. So good point. And I appreciate the other point that you made that's really important is we don't compete, right? You really have been, especially since you've been in this role, and the Wyoming Energy Authority has really been supportive of the School of Energy Resources. We need all the help we can get. We are at the University of Wyoming. We take on projects that are often larger and more applied and in the field than what a typical university would do, but we still need help to get things across the finish line, to do outreach. And quite frankly, there's times when a university partner just isn't the right person to be in the room. And we need you to go be there on Wyoming's behalf. So thank you for all you do.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think to me, I think the partnership shows the key is to know what you know, but more importantly, know what you don't know. And right, so we're not researchers, there's not engineers on my team, but we know good ones right over in your team. So just having that kind of partnership is crucial.
Yeah. And on your points on carbon capture and storage, I totally agree. I mean, our thought, you have to defend the existing fleet that's out there as we work to make Wyoming a welcoming place for new technologies. I mean, ultimately, we're going to have to see new power plants built that use coal. Someday, all the existing ones will eventually retire, no matter what you can do to save them. So we are really excited to see some ideas for new projects coming into the state. And so hopefully folks will hear more about that in the future. That's a spoiler alert. We're not going to talk about it anymore right now. But there are a lot of exciting things happening. And it's all building on this foundation that's been laid over the last few decades.
Yep,
so
absolutely.
And you moved into this role at a really interesting time for nuclear energy in Wyoming. I mean, it's such a cool time. So talk about what's happening in the state and how the Wyoming Energy Authority is engaging on nuclear energy.
Yeah, you're exactly right. I mean, my background growing up, and frankly, my family's ties, my mom was a landman for True for over 25 years. So oil and gas was the industry I knew best in energy. Frankly, didn't know a bunch about nuclear when I started, but you're right. There was a lot going on when I first took this role. So kind of got the fast track course on nuclear power all the way, from uranium mining all the way through the fuel process to generation and to storage. And so, yeah, we've entered a couple projects. I always have to give credit for, I think, nuclear power in this state really has to go to TerraPower. They were the starters, the kind of that starting gun that, this is an opportunity in Wyoming. There's a lot of ancillary benefits. They've contracted with Earthworks up in Gillette for dirt work and all these sort of great things. But we've looked at how can, on the microreactor side, how can that help certain industries in the field that, whether they have decarbonization goals, whether they have, independent electricity goals or whatever it may be. And that's where we worked with BWXT out of Lynchburg, Virginia. They, for decades, since the 60s, made nuclear reactors for submarines for the Navy. Well, now they're looking at, hey, how can we do this terrestrial? How can we put these on land? And we kind of put our hand up and said, hey, let's study this in Wyoming and see if it makes sense. And that project has really taken off to see, again, smaller output of power, but the Trona Patch was the first to raise their hand like, hey, this is something we could look at doing. And then the fun piece about that, too, was we have a lot of advanced manufacturing in the state. Who can help on that? Well, L&H Industrial and some of these other folks raised their hand to say, hey, if we're trying to build this whole economy around nuclear, let's be a part of that. So that was the power generation side. Obviously, in uranium, you've seen the massive spikes in production that are happening now, and they're going to hopefully continue. We feel very confident that will continue and that Wyoming has a place to play in the fuel cycle somewhere. So we've done a ton of analysis on whether it's enrichment, conversion, fuel fabrication, you name it, what makes the most sense. And so as we did that, it's all very expensive, but we think that fuel fabrication is kind of the first crack that makes a lot of sense for Wyoming to play in. So we entered a MOU with BWXT that makes a TRISO fuel to look at building a factory here in the state of Wyoming that could be used in their reactors here, but also spread across the country and world. So yeah, huge renaissance kind of around nuclear right now that we're excited about and hope it continues.
I think that's really interesting. I mean, energy, it's not just about producing energy. You're really looking at everything holistically, like the minerals that go into energy, the manufacturing that goes into creating energy products, and what else can we use? How can we use energy in different ways? So it is definitely of interest in some rural, very remote oil and gas production scenarios to need something like a microreactor. A lot of the time they use diesel, and diesel works. It can be expensive. We'll see if microreactors can compete or not. But also, a microreactor can run for a very long time without needing to be refueled. So it might be complementary. The point is to give energy consumers as much Wyoming energy options as possible. Yep. So it really could open up some new opportunities that might even be off the radar.
Yeah, and I think, again, back to the TerraPower one, it's I think what's cool, what's going on in Wyoming right now is really, while they're both nuclear power, they're both very different applications.
Yeah.
And so I think it's cool. I always, like when Chris Levesque gets up and speaks and says, America's next reactor is going to be in Wyoming, and that's theirs. And I think it's cool seeing that plug into the grid. Can we build more of those, right, that help into the current infrastructure and try to get more power? Because as you know, and I'm sure a lot of your listeners know, we're going to need a ton more power in the next, 20, 25 years, and nuclear has to be a player in that.
Yeah, I mean, we need more energy in general, but something that really wasn't on most people's radar 5 years ago was a significant increase in electricity demand. You did hear about it from EVs, but that hadn't really come to fruition yet. But artificial intelligence it's already started. Yeah. It's going to happen. And so that's something, not only are we not going to be able to retire plants at the rate that we have been, and in fact, as a nation, probably can't retire much of anything, we're going to need new electricity demand. So it is an exciting time, particularly for energy producers like Wyoming.
Yeah.
So what about wind and other renewables? Where does Wyoming Energy Authority play in that space?
Yeah, that's a great question. So every time I do these sort of talks or whatnot, I give shout out to you guys and your social license study, because that's what we look at a lot too when we talk about new forms of energy that could be coming to the state of Wyoming. What's the state's perspective on that? So solar, I always think solar in particular is a good one to point at. We have folks that look at building solar farms on private land. That's their choice with the landowner. But what's really interesting is when you talk about rooftop solar, the public acceptance of that is quite high. So we looked at different programs, one that we are not the applicant for, but the state of Wyoming, Montana, and Idaho kind of formed a coalition to go after what's called Solar for All. It's a program that would help put some of these panels on rooftops in areas that it made sense. I think that's the biggest piece where it makes sense. That's where we go for all energy aspects is, of course, wind, huge resource here in the state of Wyoming. Everyone who's here or has been here knows it's hits you right when you
real deal.
right when you hit the border, you feel the wind. So, obviously a huge resource there. Tricky piece that, the infrastructure authority before us was kind of charged with looking at was transmission, how we're going to get some of that to other areas. And we continue to look at that. Everyone knows permitting has to speed up. And so I think that's mainly been our play right now when we talk about wind is, if that's what folks are going to want, then there has to be some changes out in DC on permitting.
Yeah. Yeah, we've done studies. It is at least 4.5 times longer to permit wind on federal lands versus private.
Wow.
And Wyoming does have a lot of federal land, and that's also where a lot of our great wind resources. So all good points. And on our survey, I love our social license survey. We have to stagger how often we do it so we don't get survey fatigue. But one of the things that you see is Wyomingites are very open to all energy.
Yep.
We have very little opposition. We'll have a lot of favorability, a decent amount of neutral, and some unsure. And then usually in almost all cases, not all, but most cases, the lack of support or unfavorable line is the smallest. It's just, people are just very open to all sorts of energy. And you talk about rooftop solar. Well, gosh, we have a lot of really rural places where that might make more sense than it does in really urban areas. So
yeah, and as you know, in the winter, we actually have pretty sunny winters, right?
Yeah.
It is cold, but the sun is
windy.
out. Yeah, and windy. So yeah, I think I think that license study also, to your point, shows that the state is eager to learn. Well, if it might be new, it's not like a no, don't do this. Let's learn about it first and see if it makes sense.
That's what we see every time we do it. So in terms of, we mentioned minerals that were part of the energy sector. One of those that we're working on and you're also supporting is rare earth elements. critical minerals. What's WEA doing in that space?
Yeah, so, I often think about the WEA when you look at what we go after. There's kind of two lanes. One is either financing, since we manage quite a bit of state funding, or policy. So the rare earth side so far has mainly been through that financing lens. So we had a pot of money that was about $12 million stood up, and part of it was to look at rare earth critical minerals. So we put some money towards the Bear Lodge project up in Sundance, Wyoming, and then more recently the American Rare Earths project outside of Wheatland. Both are awesome projects, and we of course love to mine the resource itself, but I think the kicker to those is the separation piece of it. As you know, everywhere is rare earths. Is the concentrations right? That's, to be seen. But the biggest piece is if they are, most of those get shipped to China to get processed and then come back.
Right.
That's got to change. And so that's where we feel excited about the two projects that we've helped fund to get to that stage. They're going to, some got some DOE funding and private funding, but I think that's a huge opportunity for the state too. And in areas that, obviously the Northeast is well aware of mining, but I think in Wheatland, it could be a great boom for that town to have that mine stood up there, a lot of investment, and hopefully jobs that last quite a while.
Yeah, we're really excited about it, working with both projects. And I will just say we're really grateful to the Wyoming legislature for supporting new positions at the University of Wyoming through the School of Energy Resources that will focus really on that separations part and making these minerals or rare earth elements into products. Yeah. So that we're getting that value add activity here in the state as well. So super excited to launch that. So one of the ways that you support all these different areas is through what's called the Wyoming Energy Authority Matching Funds Program. So can you talk a little bit about what that is and how it works?
Yeah, absolutely. So this fund actually dates back to my old job in the governor's office. So shortly after the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act was passed in D.C., that was passed in November. Our legislature, as you know, comes to town in January and February. We looked at that and was like, there's a lot of opportunity for the state of Wyoming, whether that be through transportation and bridges and roads or energy. There's a lot in the energy aspects of that bill. So how can we position ourselves best? And I have to credit the legislature on this one, because at the time we weren't completely sure how the rules would shake out in DC, but we did know it was, going to be an opportunity. And so they stood up what was called the Energy Matching Fund. It's housed in the governor's office. The money is $100 million was the first appropriation. No projects had been done because, again, rulemaking was getting done in D.C., so fast track another year. And the IRA had passed. Again, more opportunity in energy if it made sense for the state of Wyoming. And so the legislature, recognizing that, put another $50 million towards the Energy Matching Fund. When I started this job, there were two projects. They were really through the whole process before, or basically right when I showed up. And so one of which was Frontier Carbon Solutions with you all at SER, and then the BWXT microreactor project. So when I started, we really put some more structure around, given the size of this amount of money, how do we want to structure this so it's well vetted, a cadence that companies can get familiar with so it's not, out of the ordinary for them. And so what we did is we stood up a quarterly process. We've changed that to triannually because, one, we have a small team, and two, dollars are getting a little tighter. But the idea is a lot like DOE, where you would submit a concept paper, tell us what your project is. The big kicker to this is the matching piece of the Energy Matching Fund. So the governor delegated that authority to administer this program to us, and in his delegation letter required that at a minimum, these projects meet a 1-to-1 matching ratio. So that's one of the first boxes we check. Do you have your money, or do you have your award from DOE? We're pretty stringent on the fact that, especially if it's private, that this is not a fund where you come to us, we give you money, then you raise money off of that award. It has to be that day you have the money.
The other way
ready.
around.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So we're follow-on capital is what I like to always say. So then at that point, say you check all the boxes, we move to a full review and a full application, which is much more in-depth. Our team does a lot of analysis and helps prepare that for the review committee, which is you are very well aware of. You sit on that, myself, Randall Luthi from the governor's office, Josh Durrell from the business council, and Liz Gagan from workforce services. And the reason we stood that up that way was to really get all aspects of these projects. So your team, with the technicality of some of these things and the research you've done, does some of this make sense, or is it very pie in the sky? Obviously, this is the governor's fund, so having a representative from his office is crucial. But then Liz's aspect is really crucial too. Looking at the jobs that could be coming with these, are these areas of the state ready for that? Are they prepared for that? Is that going to be a hurdle? And then Josh's team to really look at the community impact. So then at that point, we get together. I always joke around, it's like a mini Shark Tank. We get to listen to what their pitch is and what they're going to do. And then we just get a recommendation to the governor for, funding, whether that's the full amount or different or not to fund. And then he decides at the end of the day what to do. So I think that process has gone well. The legislature did add $5 million to it last year. And I think it's really created, some of these projects wouldn't happen here without this. And so I think for the legislature, again, crediting them, because Texas, North Dakota, Oklahoma, some of these other states that have a lot of energy opportunity, they're chomping at the bit for these sort of things too. So it really keeps us in the game.
Well, and some of them also set up matching fund pools. Yeah. And so, for example, there is a large energy institute in North Dakota. We partner with them all the time. They're great partners, EERC, but they had access to this kind of support, and we would not have been able to compete if we couldn't have access to kind of like be on a level playing field with them. So we've been really grateful. It's been really incredible for the School of Energy Resources to work with you on the energy matching funds. And I can just say that we've brought quite a few projects to the state of Wyoming we could not have done otherwise.
Yeah, absolutely. And I often, it is a lot of money, but I often tell folks too, when you look at who pays the bulk of the taxes in this state to begin with, in a way, we're giving it back to those industries. Like, hey, if you have a new idea that can, help with whatever aspect to keep your market there, come to us with your innovation and see if we can move you through.
We are investing in those industries. That's all SER works on. So.
Yep.
So, Rob, what do you think the greatest challenges and opportunities are for Wyoming's energy industry?
I think challenges, first and foremost, are how we keep our fossil fuels marketable, right? And I think whatever people's position on climate is and those sort of things, we don't, trend into that sort of discussion, but there's a couple facts. We're going to need power. We're going to need more of it. So, these different resources. But again, in industry being supportive, I fall back to carbon capture, right? That is our main goal, to keep gas and coal firing. And I think that's a challenge, right? Because we have forces out east, sometimes in DC, that make regulations very difficult for some of our operators to continue. But I think that's a challenge. But then on the flip side is a huge opportunity. I think when you look at the research you all have done, some of the technologies we're funding and working on carbon capture, if we can be a lead on that in Wyoming, we can help export that out to other states and hopefully other countries and try to have an economic benefit from that. So while I think our biggest challenge is also our biggest opportunity.
Great answer. So the Wyoming Energy Authority, you're able to work, like I said earlier, in ways that we can't at the School of Energy Resources, and we can give you as much information as you can use. But at the end of the day, someone has to go out and represent Wyoming in regional and national energy issues. And often the best entity to do that is the Wyoming Energy Authority. So can you give some examples on initiatives that you've engaged on?
Yeah, absolutely. So we serve on the Western Interstate Energy Board. If you think about North Dakota down to Texas, everything west of that, that's the coalition of states to really talk about utility markets in the West and what things are looking at. This RTO discussion around which utilities join which groups, what groups have stances on carbon, which don't, all these sort of things. So very contentious issues. But to your point, I often use the phrase that if we're not at the table, we're going to be on the menu. So those are things that we make sure we're a part of. We're also a part of NASIO, which is the countrywide association of state energy officials. And that's been a really exciting one because our region, they're broken out into regions, and ours is kind of wonky because Louisiana is technically in it, which is usually not the case. But when we talk about, class 6 permits and those sort of things, how we got primacy, us, North Dakota, Louisiana are all in the same region. So we have those discussions and share best practices because, again, I think Wyoming's lucky to have, more resources than most states when it comes to energy, but that also means we can, learn from one another. So those are the two big organizations we're a part of, but you're right, we have to be at the table. So
yeah, good points. I think the other thing we haven't mentioned as a big strength for Wyoming is the Department of Environmental Quality and the fact that the legislature and the governor's office have repeatedly supported DEQ to get primacy in whatever we can get primacy in that's relevant for Wyoming. I will just say in my time here, they've been incredible to work with, and whatever we can control that isn't being regulated by DC, that's a good use of our time.
Absolutely. And I think back to the challenges, as you know, these companies are planning 20 plus years out.
Yeah.
when there's huge change in policies in DC every 4 to 8 years, that is really difficult for them to try to, put big investments forward. So trying to help them on that too is a crucial piece.
Yeah. And it's the reason energy capital investments have to be really strategic, and they almost have to be regulation proof. And so when you talk about carbon capture and storage, we got to have it if you're going to get new plants, because they need to know that they can operate. We often talk about 30 years, but really what power plant operates for 30 years? Right. Almost nothing. So they operate for much, much longer, 50, 60 years. So we have to figure out technologies to make them really future proof so that we can keep selling our energy long into the future.
Yep.
So we have a lot of students and hopefully potential students for the School of Energy Resources. And it sounds like you know a lot about Landman. That's one of our 2 programs for undergrads. And we have faculty members who listen to this podcast. You're a UW grad. I'd love to get your perspective on, or what would you say to students that are either at UW, considering going to UW, on potential careers for professionals in Wyoming and just in general, but also in the energy sector?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, one of the statistics that I hate about the state is how many of our graduates leave, right? And I understand. It's I was presented with opportunities to leave right off the bat. But for those that are listening, I would say don't jump at something that's flashy maybe in a bigger city, because there's tons of opportunity in the state of Wyoming. Not only professionally, but when you look at policymakers and some of the decision makers in the state, you can meet them. You can sit down with them and chat with them. You can't in some of these bigger states, right? So I think a huge advantage the state of Wyoming has is, I often said this in my old job, that if you haven't met the governor, that's probably on you, because he meets with just about anybody. And that is a huge advantage for us to be able to have, whether it's energy or whatever it may be, have those discussions with people that are really making those decisions. And again, I think it's the pragmatic approach that I know SER has to energy and that we have too. That's going to happen, decades down the road are going to continue to have these projects, which means jobs. And energy sector, as you know, are very well-paying jobs. If you look at the median income for the state of Wyoming, it's higher than most states, and that's because of energy. And so I often tell folks that are either going to UW or getting ready to graduate, don't rush off. There's a lot of opportunity in the state of Wyoming, and one of the reasons I wanted to stay here was to kind of prove that to some folks, that you can be born and raised here and do this and make a career here and really make a difference going forward.
You can, and that's a really key point. I always say, you're not a cog in the wheel in Wyoming. You can make a difference. If you have a good idea here, you can go meet with the governor, you can meet with you, Rob, or me, or legislators, and you can get it done.
Yep.
And so if you want to see impact during your career, this is a great place to be in. In energy, you truly can have a career, not just a job.
Absolutely.
So, well, really appreciate it. So for our last question, it's not about energy. It is, what is your favorite place to visit in Wyoming?
My favorite place, like I said earlier, born and raised in Casper, would have to be just west of Casper on the North Platte in the Gray Reef section, getting out there and fly fishing when I can, and knock on wood when the wind's not howling too much. But that, I know a lot of folks like Jackson and Devil's Tower, obviously beautiful places, but that's probably my favorite place to be.
I think the Platte might be the most beautiful place in the world.
Yes.
It's amazing.
Yep.
Well, Rob, thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you for all you do for SER, for Wyoming. Thank you so much.
Yeah, likewise. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Energy Frontier, the Wyoming Landscape, the podcast that highlights the School of Energy Resources at the University of Wyoming. You can expect a new episode of Energy Frontier every Wednesday on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. See you next time.